Hey everybody, this is Dan and welcome to the first week of the semester. As you know, this is Business Technology in American Society, and also if you read through on Blackboard, you already know that the theme this semester is a history of business technology and society and 14 innovations. So let's go ahead and get into it. First of all, I think you all know what an innovation is, but I'll cover it just to be sure. An innovation is something new. So it can be a new method, a new idea. Sometimes we think in terms of an innovative new product, but certainly it can be an idea or a method as well. So just, so you know that an innovation implies something new and different and maybe even something disruptive. So, if we're all operating on the same definition, we'll be good to go. So, our first innovation for the semester is free market capitalism, and I know this sounds a little boring, but we need to get through this. It'll help us understand the businesses and technologies as we move forward. So you're going to read an article this week called "Capitalism Came on the First Ships," and what it's talking about is this idea that since the founding of this country, since the first British colonists came here in the 1609, this has been a capitalist enterprise. In other words, the first colonists came here to grow tobacco, and their framework for property was that property should be privately held. In other words, you can go buy a house, I can go buy a house. We have private property here, and it's not just property like land, but also property like factories and like intellectual property like ideas. So capitalism refers to private ownership of property, private ownership of businesses, private ownership of ideas, and it's been here for a long time. If you think of Western countries like Germany or France, their history is much longer than ours. And it goes back into feudalism and monarchy. Since day one, because we're really newer as a country, we've been a free enterprise capitalist country. So the roots go back a long way, is the point. One of the most famous sayings, and probably a good one to frame this class, comes from Calvin Coolidge when he said, "The business of America is business." And that's in evidence all around us. Every night, the stock market's a big thing on TV, the Dow Jones. Politicians talk about the economy all the time. So it's really something that's ingrained in our society, and that's why we're studying it, to understand where these ideas come from and how they shake out. So capitalism, again, private ownership for profit. And you can contrast that as an economic framework to socialism and communism. So, in communism, there's no private ownership. Property is publicly owned. Probably the best example of that is the USSR prior to 1989, where, the oil company is private owned or government owned. The airline is government owned and controlled. And socialism is sometimes seen as an in-between of that. But these definitions are really tricky, because what I'm talking about is really an economic construct, and there's so much more behind these definitions, like political stuff. So generally we think of communist countries as not being free, not having freedom of the press, and that may be true, but I'm not talking about politics right now. I'm just talking about the economics of these systems, private ownership versus public ownership. So these two guys, this is Adam Smith right there, this is Karl Marx, and Adam Smith is really considered the father of capitalism in many ways, or at least the father of free enterprise or free markets. And he wrote a book back in 1776 called The Wealth of Nations, and I'll talk a little bit more about his philosophy on the next slide. Karl Marx, you may have heard of this word Marxism. All right, so Karl Marx was a historian, philosopher, and economist in the mid 1800s, and he wrote a book called Das Kapital. And his whole idea was that capitalism, because it's based on maximizing profits, is not sustainable. In other words, capitalism always exploits the working class. It always exploits the environment. Good example of that is, coal companies or companies that want to burn coal for electricity. To maximize profits, they could totally ignore any pollution controls. That's an exploitation of the environment. Exploitation of workers we see all the time. Many of you probably make minimum wage jobs where the owners of the corporation, makes thousands of times more money than you do. And it's easy to say, hey, it's his business, he can do what he wants, and that's cool. But Marx saw this idea of a working class that could never get ahead, and really thought that capitalism was not sustainable, and he thought that everything would go communist because the working class would eventually rise up and take over from the capitalist. So really, if you look at these philosophies in a little bit more detail, they're very complicated, and this class isn't all about studying capitalism and communism. So I'm just giving you a really brief overview, but Smith was the guy that thought free markets would take care of everything, and Marx was the guy who thought anytime private businesses or private ownership of land was involved, that it wouldn't be sustainable because the working class would always be shut out. And again, these are touchy subjects with many people in the country, as witnessed by the political debates right now. One of the reasons that Trump got in office is, hey, he's a good businessman, or at least that's what people think. And one of the reasons Obama wasn't popular amongst the same people that voted for Trump was they thought he was trying to push too many regulations on business, such as pollution controls. You hear of mandatory minimum wage. That's something that's not popular with many conservatives because they see that as something that's regulating their businesses. So again, I think this idea of socialism versus capitalism and how it shakes out, but just understand it has a long history in this country, and it's a very touchy subject. So, why is it a touchy subject? I think there are a number of reasons, but certainly our country was founded on the basis of liberty and freedom, and anytime you have government interference in business, it comes off as something that is tyrannical or is being forced upon you. We have a legacy of rejecting tyranny here ever since the late 1700s when the colonies were breaking away from Great Britain. It was this idea that we don't want to be controlled by King George. We don't want to be taxed without representation. And again, ideologically, that same idea goes into communism, where the government or someone else controls what you do when it comes to your business or your property. So I think you can kind of get a feel for these reasons. Again, there's always people in the class that are really sensitive about this, and all we're looking at is a strictly scientific economic framework of capitalism versus socialism, and this idea that capitalism is all about private property. Probably the third reason that we're kind of touchy about it here is because we were in the Cold War forever, from after World War II to 1989, and it was sort of us versus the communists, the USSR at that time. And even in Russia today, you still see a little bit of that. So, we're always seeing socialism or communism as a really bad thing because Americans are touchy about who's controlling you and who's telling you what to do. That having been said, there's no black or white to these things. So, people will say, hey, we're a capitalist country, the government stays out of everything. But at the same time, when you look at the subtleties of our society, so public schools are technically socialist enterprises because you have no choice but to pay property taxes, which fund public schools. So that's really a socialist enterprise. It's really run by the government. Certainly the highway system, the defense system, these are all socialist ideas because you're forced to pay for these things. So when you think about socialism and what you're forced to do, there's no black or white. And I'm not going to put a stake in the ground and say, hey, we're 100% capitalist or Canada is all socialist, whatever. I'm just telling you that you need to look out for these subtleties because there's no black and white when it comes to economics, and there's certainly no black and white when it comes to history. So the point is that regardless of what anyone says, there's no pure form of capitalism, socialism, or communism, and there never has been. There's always private business somewhere in some economy. So, what you need to do for this week is pretty easy. I want you to introduce yourself on the discussion board and, tell a little bit about yourself. But again, everybody can read this, so just divulge as much as you want and no more. You're going to read a brief article. It's on the web, actually, and there's a link to it on your Blackboard site. It came in the first ships. It's written by Thomas McCraw. I think it's a page or a page and a half, so it'll take you 10 minutes to read. But I just want you to understand that capitalism's been around a long time, and before we can talk about the history of business in this country, you need to understand what it is and why it's here and why it's been around. And then also there's another article called Defining Capitalism, Communism, Fascism, and Socialism. Some of this stuff is political, so you don't have to worry about it. But again, it's just another refresher to kind of get this idea of capitalism into your head, because that's our module objective. That's our learning objective for this week. And then finally, you have one more thing. There's a discussion board post, Greedy by Nature, and I want you to think about private enterprise and privately owned business in the framework of capitalism, and I want you to write about whether or not capitalism is always greedy by nature. In other words, will businesses always take advantage of their workers to maximize profits, or not? Is there something called moral capitalism? That's what I like to think about. Capitalism that's sort of a kinder, gentler capitalism where people are taken care of. And I think many of you have probably worked for companies or worked for people that don't pay you a lot, but they make a lot of money at your expense. But then there are others of you who work for companies that are great, and they pay a fair wage, they offer great benefits, and so that's really getting more to this idea of moral capitalism. So do those things this week. Again, I welcome everybody to class. I look forward to working with you, and I'll talk to you again next week. Be safe. Take care.